Hi, environmental methodologists. There are two lectures this week, critical thinking and well, this one, which is on critical thinking, and the next one, which is on science. But critical thinking and science are the themes of the week. So without further ado, I think I'll just get in by starting to introduce a few famous scientists. The first is, I'm going to try my French, Francois Barré-Sinoussi. And let's see, she is famous. She's a virologist. She is French, and she is a virologist. I think she got the Nobel Prize for discovering that HIV caused AIDS. Back in the day when all these people were dying, no one knew why, and she helped discover why. It was this virus. And then Mae Jemison. Mae Jemison is she is a PhD in I think well she has a background in some kind of engineering, I think chemical engineering, and also she has a MD. She, as it shows, was a NASA astronaut and worked for NASA for many years, and she has since gone on to do a number of other kind of public service, nonprofit, having advocacy having to do with education. And the next is Beatrix Potter. I don't know if you read any of Beatrix Potter. She was an English woman, and she is probably best known for her series of Benjamin Bunny and Peter Rabbit children's books. I don't know if you read them when you were a kid, but I did, and I read them to my kids. They're beautiful little books. Kids can't resist them, and they are just delightful. But what she is less well known for is that she was actually quite an ardent botanist. And while at the time, let's see, what Wikipedia tells me is that in the Victorian age, women were encouraged to get an education, but they couldn't go to school. So if they were wealthy enough, they got private tutors to learn stuff. That was the class of society that she belonged to. And she ended up learning a lot and becoming quite a good mycologist. And she actually proposed some really interesting ideas on how mushrooms reproduce, how fungi reproduce, and worked that up into a paper, but she was unable to present that to the various scientific societies of the time. Guess why? Of course, because she was a woman, and she was able to have her stuff presented to these academies by a male mentor, which is humiliating and sad. And 50 years after her death, I think it was the Linnean Society in England apologized for its sexist treatment of Beatrix Potter and other women. Anyway, moving on, Tyrone Hayes. Tyrone Hayes teaches, he's a professor at Cal, UC Berkeley, and he is he's a chemist. He's, I guess you could say, a biochemist, and you could further refine that by saying he is an environmental biochemist. He's probably best well known for his work showing the link between an herbicide, atrazine, and its effect on, it's an endocrine disruptor. So maybe you remember that your endocrine system produces hormones. Hormones have very powerful influences on lots of things, including how our bodies develop from being an egg to being an embryo to being an adult. And if you disrupt that, terrible things can happen. And what he showed was that actually, you're going to read this article next week or this week. So you'll be learning pretty soon what he showed. He's also, in addition to showing that connection between some chemical pollutants and the environment, he's also shown that let's see, I want to say it exactly right so I don't get it wrong, and I'm cheating, that environmental chemical contamination disproportionately affects minority and low-income peoples. Sound familiar? It does, and hopefully, if I remember in class, we're going to take a little Google Earth trip to some places where there's a lot of chemical pollution and disadvantaged people. Next up is Alfred Wallace. Alfred Wallace, if you think of the theory of evolution, you might think of Charles Darwin, if you were taught that. And it turns out that Charles and Alfred were contemporaries. Charles came from a relatively wealthy, ennobled family. He had money, he had connections. Alfred, not so much. He always lived on a shoestring, never had a steady income. Darwin could always fall back on his family for money, not so Wallace, who ended up like selling specimens for money. They simultaneously came up, and actually they co-published early works proposing this theory of evolution. Darwin went on to write his voluminous on the origin of species, etc. And he gets the credit now for discovering evolution, when in fact Wallace and their correspondence with each other, it was simultaneous. I'll just say, I think the relationship between them was probably very gentlemanly, and maybe there was some friendship involved. In later life, Darwin actually arranged Alfred Wallace to get a government pension so he could have money after when he got old. So I think that's kind of a cool story. All right, so I would just put him in here as an underdog. Nitza Margarita Cintron, she is Puerto Rican, and in researching her, I saw the phrase Puerto Rican citizen, and like, wait a minute, I thought if you're a citizen, if you live in Puerto Rico, you're an American citizen, a U.S. citizen, and I had to look that up, and actually, no, you can be a Puerto Rican citizen. I think you're automatically given U.S. citizenship too, if you have that, but it led me into a deep rabbit hole on the history of Puerto Rico and the United States that is interesting. Anyway, Dr. Cintron, let's see, jog my memory here. Oh, yeah, she's got both an MD and a PhD. You try getting both an MD and a PhD. She's got those, and she's just got this long career working in NASA. She has founded various medicine branches of NASA, space medicine, and been quite the leader in NASA. Lastly, let's talk briefly about Mario Molina. He is a Mexicano, and he's is a chemist, and he got a Nobel Prize for establishing the link between anthropogenic chlorofluorocarbon, CFC, and stratospheric ozone depletion, that is the ozone hole. So he, I think he may have shared that Nobel Prize, I'm not sure, but he got it, he was there, he broke the news. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce this slate of characters, and probably you've noticed something about this group. Hey, they're not all white men. Maybe you didn't notice that, but when I was back in my day, when teachers talked about famous scientists, you would only get a slate of old white men. Think of them: Newton, Darwin, Watson and Crick, Einstein, and that's what you would get. I ain't giving that, folks. And here's why. First of all, because it's bullshit. Here's why it's bullshit. So the theme that is going to run throughout this course, Environmental Methods, is the theme of bias. Now, when I use that word, probably if you were at a bar somewhere and someone said, that's biased, you probably are thinking of like racial bias or discrimination or sexism or something like that, when in fact, bias has a deeper meaning. Bias is basically subjectivity. And one of the goals of science is to discover the truth, the objective truth. And as we'll talk about soon, there's a number of ways you can prevent subjectivity from affecting your discovery of objective truth. For instance, in experiments, you want to put in a control, which is something that's untreated. And the reason you include a control is to avoid bias in the experimental method. Another thing you do in the scientific method is you have anonymous peer review. Why do you have anonymous peer review? Because if it weren't anonymous, then the reviewers would be thinking, hey, this is like a really rich, powerful scientist doing this paper, and if I suck up to them and say, wow, that was the greatest scientific paper ever, maybe they'll give me some money or help my career or my children. And that would be biased, and so that would mess up the whole process. So long story short, scientific method was invented in about 1600s when it arose as, back then it was called natural philosophy. And so I guess back then the folks said, it's hard, our subjectivity is messing up our ability to learn stuff, and we'd really like to learn some more stuff so we can make better guns and stuff and kill the other people faster. and medicine and so forth. And so we're going to do these things that are going to reduce bias. And that worked really great. But that was about as far as they could go. They couldn't see that bias also infected all aspects of their society, including membership in their scientific communities. So that's why poor Beatrix Potter was not recognized for her work. And very slowly, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, early 2000s, very slowly, maybe we're doing something to address bias that way. Anyway, so we'll have a whole section on what bias is and all the different kinds of bias. I think it's really important to understand how we are subjective. And so I wanted to introduce this slate of famous scientists as an example of maybe how we're addressing bias in the social aspect of science. Now, another thing, it's obvious. When I created this slide, I had to I need some people of color here. I need women, famous scientists, and I left some white people in. And I don't know, if you want to make a slide of 7 or 8 famous scientists that is perfectly representative of all aspects of scientists, maybe you could help me out. If your particular favorite group of human beings is not represented here, I apologize. Hope you forgive me. Okay, so specifically, the learning objectives of this presentation is to improve your self-awareness of what we think is true and why we think it's true. So you should ask yourself, in fact, it wouldn't be a bad idea to pause the presentation and ask yourself what you think is true and why you think it's true. What are the fundamental reasons for why you think something is true? I'm going to go ahead and give a list of reasons why I think humans come to believe what they think is true, but I just dreamed it up. I've thought about it for several years. I haven't thought of everything. You might have some other ways, but maybe judge what I say later on against what you think right now, why you think something is true, and especially why you think something is true. All right, I'm going to continue, though I do urge you to stop and ponder that question first. We are going to, I want to make sure you understand the components of critical thinking. I'll say why in a moment. And then raise the question, should we always be critical thinkers? Okay, so pretty straightforward, pretty simple, only about 13 slides or so in this lecture. Okay, here's my take on how we come to believe what we think is true. I would say one of the first things is faith. You complete trust or confidence in someone or something. If you have complete faith in a person and they tell you something, then you will believe that to be true. Okay? So for instance, I'll give you an example. I have complete faith in a biology textbook. I mean, I shouldn't, but I'm just saying. That's an example. So when I open it and I read it and it says the diversity of life is because of evolution, I'm going to believe that. I shouldn't. I should exercise critical thinking. But if I had complete trust or confidence, I would. And I'm afraid it kind of scares me sometimes how students tend to believe what they're told. Like, when you're given a book, we tend to believe what's in it because the professor signed it and it must be true. That bothers me. Books are great, but complete faith scares me. Personal experience. So there's nothing like personal experience to convince you something is true. I saw that UFO. I saw it. I believe it. It's weird sometimes when you actually see something and you start double guessing yourself. Did I actually see that? Anyway, personal experience is definitely one reason why people come to believe what they think is true. Authority. So authority is, I guess, when there's some other entity out there that I guess you have faith in or you're supposed to believe in or has demonstrated some ability, then you tend to believe what they think is true. It's sort of difficult to distinguish authority from faith, and there's overlap between all these things. Like my personal experience with my mechanic is he fixed my car. I thought it was one thing, he thought it was something else, and he was right, and he didn't charge me much. So I give him authority. I also start to have faith that he's probably good at fixing cars. So you could have authority could be a person or a group of people. So maybe the minister in your church, or maybe the I don't know, the faculty in your university could be examples of authority. Maybe it's a book like that textbook. It's convincing. Or maybe any other book you happen to read that you might give it authority. Wikipedia. I put this in. It's kind of like, oh really? Boy, man, I have to share with you what I believe in Wikipedia. Having been torched by students in the past when they ask me something, or I tell them I found out something on Wikipedia. Here's my opinion on Wikipedia. It is a fantastic place to get some information. It's a really great starting place when you have a question, like those scientists. I just got their bio from Wikipedia. If I was really serious about the concept, like whether vaccinations can cause autism, I would not stop with Wikipedia because, as you know, wiki means edited by a bunch of different people. I don't know who those people are. I don't actually have a lot of faith in them. I don't give them a lot of authority. And so if I wanted to really follow up, if something was really important to me, then I would go down to their list of resources and do further research, particularly primary sources, to discover whether, more information, to get more information to allay my doubts about the veracity of Wikipedia. But the bottom line is, hey, I've used it a lot. You have too. It's a fantastic opening way to get research. Okay, the next one is just how we come to believe something is true is just through logic. Well, if this, then that, then it must be true. Okay, just pure reason. If it makes sense, then it's probably true. Here's just an example of the poor application, a failed attempt to apply logic. This happened, I'll just read it first of all. Domoic acid kills crabs. Domoic acid is what happens when there's a red tide. So that's true. Domoic acid kills crabs, I guess. It's actually, I don't know if it does kill crabs. It's dangerous for humans. And this person was walking on the beach and they saw lots of crab shells washing up on the beaches. Therefore, this person concluded, the ocean is filled with poisonous domoic acid. So the person, this happened, I won't give you the details. I should never look at online forums. Anyway, it happened in an online forum. This person had the premise that domoic acid kills crabs. The personal observation that lots of crab shells were washing up on the beaches, and then this conclusion here. So it follows it seems like a logical argument. It is a bad logical argument. The premises are wrong. Actually, there's some other premises not included, and it just doesn't follow good logical rules. But if you do follow good logic, then that might be some reason why you come to think something is true. And lastly, experimentation. I include this because we don't realize it, but we use experimentation has the consequences of experimentation affect our life in so many ways. Right now, you're not looking at me. You're looking at a monitor that's glowing with color, that's using electricity and electronic engineering and computing to make my face go onto your screen. And all of that is a product of experimentation. So we're alive. Most of us are alive today. Many of us would have died a long time ago from one illness or accident or another, but for a lot of experimentation that has led to modern medical practices. So I would prefer that experimentation is a mixture of all these things. It's a mixture of logic, authority, and personal experience, and maybe even a little bit of faith. Okay, so I asked you to make a list of why you think things are true. How do you come to believe what you believe? And now I ask you to compare your list to my list and see if they substitute fairly well with each other. If there's anything on your list that is clearly not part of my list, please let me know. I'd be really interested to know that, and maybe I could modify this list. Okay, so I'm starting out here because we're going to go on and talk about critical thinking, and then we're going to talk about science later on this week and throughout this semester. And all that is an attempt to understand objective reality. And so trying to figure out, hold on a sec. That was my daughter throwing pebbles at my window to get my attention. Luckily, she's gone away. Anyway, where were we? Yeah, experimentation is a mixture of all these things, and maybe even a little bit of faith. And I get into huge arguments with my science friends on whether or not science is a faith-based practice. But we'll talk about that in the next lecture. Okay, so in bold, oh, you probably can't see it because my face is over it. Science is one very powerful way of coming to an understanding of the truth. There are many other ways to come to an understanding of the truth, but maybe not all equally powerful, at least here in the corporeal world. Like that, you might have spiritual truths that affect if you believe in soul and afterlife and so forth. That's stuff that science has no comment on whatsoever, but doesn't make it not spiritually powerful. But here in the corporeal plane, not the spiritual plane, science is super powerful. There's other ways to come to an understanding of the truth. There's lots of other kinds of medicine, for instance, that don't rely on the scientific method. Are they as powerful as science? That's actually an area of some debate. I would say that science has come up with some great approaches to health, for instance, eradicating polio and smallpox. And when you have that cavity in your mouth and you need to, science has been very helpful with dentistry to get that filled without a whole lot of pain, as opposed to some other ways of doing it. Okay, anyway, so onward. Okay, so scientists use critical thinking, and you are supposed to know what critical thinking is. Why do I say that? Because A, it's a liberal arts institution. My text's not working right. There it is. It's a liberal arts education and central. This is a liberal arts university, as most American universities are. And an important component of the liberal arts education is that we know it. We use critical thinking. Critical thinking isn't what most students think critical thinking is, which is they think critical thinking is criticizing shit. And that is not only what critical thinking is. So before I dig into it, I just want to show you that what guides all your classes in this university is this critical thinking learning outcome. This is a if you're in an upper division area B class, you're supposed to get this. And I hope you did. Upon completing this requirement, you'll be able to identify premises and conclusion of an argument, know the basics of logic, and determine its validity and soundness, to analyze, criticize, and advocate ideas. So there is some criticizing, but that's like picking apart, testing, we'll talk about this in a sec. You should be able to distinguish deductive from inductive argument forms, identify their fallacies, and reason inductively and deductively, and distinguish matters of fact from issues of judgment or opinion, and reach well-supported factual or judgmental conclusions from a wide diversity of real-world examples. So, if you read the college catalog before you came to Humboldt State University, you would have seen this and said, huh, that's cool, I want that, that would be good for me. My guess is that no one actually does this, and yet critical thinking is supposed to be this important thing. So it falls to me, it's my job, to look at critical thinking at least for 5 minutes and hope that I can communicate something important to you. Now, this previous slide, wordy, right? Did you follow any of it? Maybe a little bit. You going to remember any of it? Probably not, unless I tell you to, so I'm telling you to. Here's some things I want you to focus in on that previous slide. For instance, what is a premise? Because it said, identify the premises and conclusion. I do not assume you know what a premise is. I'm going to tell you. A premise is a previous statement or proposition. Domoic acid kills crabs. In that previous argument, that in the exercise of logic I showed you a few slides ago, the person said Domoic acid kills crabs. That is a premise. I'm not actually sure it does or not. Someone would have to look that up to test that premise, to criticize it. Okay, so are the premises valid? Are they sound? Are they good ones? Or are you uncertain on whether they're valid or not? In which case, you need to do some research to really apply critical thinking. You need to analyze, criticize, and advocate arguments. Okay, wait a minute. Don't just let those roll over you like water. Those are three very different things. Analyze means basically picking apart the argument. Every argument is composed of different steps, and so you need to do that rather than just let it wash over you and accept the conclusion. You need to criticize what you find. Look at it and judge it for its validity. And the third thing is advocate, which is the opposite. I suppose what that statement means is after you've analyzed an argument and criticized it, if you found it sound and accepted its conclusion, you ain't done. Because the next step as a citizen is to advocate for the truth of that argument if you think it's a good one. That means part of critical thinking is contributing to your society, which I find a fascinating inclusion and one which is probably overlooked by everybody who looks at that statement. So pay attention to it. Okay, a fallacy. I had to look up that word. What is a fallacy? It's a failure in reasoning. If this and that, then not that. It's basically a fallacy is poor logic. And then distinguish matters of fact from issues of judgment. So somebody says things in an argument, so you should ask, is that true or is that just their opinion? Okay. All right, so just please look at these aspects of this previous slide and think about them a little more carefully than maybe you have before. Okay, moving on. Oh, and lastly, you're supposed to reach well-supported factual or judgmental conclusions. Oh, hey, there was, and he went so fast. Reach well-supported factual conclusions. Yes, the domoic acid from experimental data does kill crabs. Then there's judgmental conclusions. And here's the deal, folks. Sometimes you get a lot of facts, but there's always some element maybe of uncertainty involved in the conclusion. And so you might render a judgment, but your judgment should be tempered by subjectivity, or maybe tempered by subjectivity, in which case you should say so. For instance, we're not exactly sure that the domoic acid is killing all these crabs, but the evidence sure suggests it. It's possible there's some other things, but there's a preponderance of evidence that this is. So I'm rendering my judgment probably domoic acid. Okay, oh man, it's also said to know the difference between deduction and induction. So deductive and inductive reasoning, they're so similar, they're hard to tell apart, but you got to learn them. So here's the deal. Deductive reasoning is given the premises, if they're true, let's just say they're true, and the rules of logic, then the conclusion follows without exception. And underlined, the conclusion is certain in deductive reasoning. Whereas, here's an example. All animals with fur are mammals. Jake is an animal with fur. Therefore, Jake is a mammal. I think if you think about that, that is deductive reasoning. So if you take the premises, the conclusion here that Jake is a mammal follows without exception. All animals with fur. Jake is an animal. He has fur. It said all. So he's got to be a mammal. It can't be anything else. Inductive reasoning also includes premises and rules of logic, but the conclusion follows with some degree of uncertainty. I'm going to give a 4-year-old example. Political polling methods are pretty accurate. Most polls gave Clinton a 95% chance of winning. Therefore, Clinton will probably be our next president. Actually, you know what? That is almost a deductive reasoning because in the conclusion, there's the word probably. And 95%, that means it's probable. So maybe this isn't a great example, But if you said, therefore, Clinton will be our next president. Anyway, the point is that there is some degree of uncertainty. Oh, by the way, just because there's a 95% chance of something happening, it doesn't mean it's really going to happen, folks. Okay, anyway, moving on. So, dang, wasn't that enough about critical thinking? No, I've got 5 additional characteristics of critical thinking, and I want you to memorize them for the midterms and the quizzes, and for your own good. These are good. Okay, number 1, seeing both sides of an issue. Okay, you say something is this, but maybe something else. Maybe there's another way of seeing it. Be open-minded, think outside the box. Also, being open to new evidence that contradicts your own ideas. So if you believe everything is black and white, then you're only going to see things that are black and white and not see shades of gray. Anyway, it's important to be open to new evidence. Anytime you've really had a problem, have really been in a pickle, can't figure something out, probably you solved it by being open to new evidence that you didn't know before, and then realizing, oh, that's how it works. Okay, so that's a good example of critical thinking. Reasoning dispassionately. Yelling loudly is not critical thinking. So when you see somebody, passionate argumentation is not a characteristic of critical thinking, right? Why should emotion be involved when what we're talking about is something that's based in logic? Demanding that claims be backed by, not that you can't be passionate about something. Maybe once you've discovered something's going on, you might get very passionate about it. That's fine. But in going through the logical steps to come to a conclusion, passion does not have a role. All right, demanding that claims be backed by evidence. So you said that domoic acid kills crabs. Why do you think that? Okay, so you got to do that. That's really common, that claims are made with no evidence. All right, and deducing and inferring conclusions based on available facts. So we already covered deduction and inference. Okay, now that's 5 things, right? That's 5 aspects of critical thinking. And really, I want you to know them. So I might ask you to give an example of how you used critical thinking last week. And I want you, when you do give that example, please refer to one of the examples, one of the components given in lecture. Okay, so be prepared to do that. However, even these are 5 great characteristics. But some people say using critical thinking is difficult without what's called domain knowledge. Some people say critical thinking is hard to teach unless people have domain knowledge. With domain knowledge, complicated term, all it means is facts, experience with stuff. So you have a background that has taught you a lot about certain things, and I do too. I'll just tell you, I know a lot about mushrooms. I spent years studying the biology of mushrooms, mycology. I have an enormous amount of domain knowledge with mushrooms, okay? So I am more equipped to seeing both sides of an issue, being open to new evidence, reasoning dispassionately, understanding that claims must be backed by evidence, and deducing and inferring conclusions based on available facts regarding mycology. You probably don't have that. So like I might have one opinion on whether mushrooms can be tasted or not, and that's based upon my domain knowledge. Like even wild unknown mushrooms, turns out you can as long as you spit it out, even the poisonous ones. Okay, so you can't become a genius critical thinker unless you also actually know some stuff. Okay, so domain knowledge is the buzzword there. Hope that makes sense. Okay, that was a nice slide. Remember what it said? Well, if not, get to studying, guys. Come on, let's get going. Do it later. Let's use critical thinking to consider presidential inauguration attendance slide. Okay, this is the Trump-Obama inauguration attendance size. Maybe you forget that at some point the size of these two audiences was a big deal. People were arguing over it. And I remember that time, and I remember people on both sides saying, making all kinds of claims. And first of all, at this point, I do not care about this issue at all. And also, this is not an opportunity for me to say something about what I think about any presidents of the United States, former, present, or future. That's not what this is about. This is about looking at some claim that was passionately made in the media and my using critical thinking to look at that claim. That's what this is about, using critical thinking. Okay, so here's two pictures, Obama on the left, Trump on the right, and people say Obama's is bigger than Trump's. And here's two pictures, and yet this is not any evidence of anything, really, until you know more about the pictures. So it could be that, okay, I mean, you can't say these people didn't show up at that inauguration, but maybe there's reasons that this is small. Maybe it's earlier, maybe it's later, maybe the weather, something like that. So number one, I'm being open to the idea that the claims, any claim made, are wrong. And I'm going to look for evidence for whether, for either claim. I'm going to reason dispassionately, I hope. And I'm going to try to use logic and deduce and infer facts. And maybe I'll get some domain knowledge too. So here's just another picture. This is Donald Trump walking down to the podium to be sworn into office. And you can look, and here's all these people around him. Hey, that looks like a pretty big crowd, actually. And it's really, I'm going to come back to this in a second, but first let me go through the text. Some more information about these images. Both of them came from Reuters via ABC News. So they came from the same media source. Could that source be lying to us? Maybe, but if they're lying to us about that, then we're really screwed. I'm just going to assume I'll give them authority. Okay, their pictures are probably okay. Not doctored too much. The one on the left was Obama's, as I said, and was taken at 11 in the morning while the Obamas were still inside the Capitol. And the weather was sunny. The temperature was cold. It was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's a wind chill that brought it down to the mid-teens. I remember it being cold because one of the performers at Obama's inauguration was a cellist named Yo-Yo Ma. And a cello is notorious for going out of tune. And Yo-Yo Ma, knowing this, instead of bringing out a typical wooden cello, brought a metal cello out and played on a metal cello, which presumably doesn't lose tune even though it's super cold outside. So yeah, it was freaking cold. On the right was Trump's inauguration. It was at 12 noon, and Trump was just about to begin his address. Oh, so it wasn't like early. Maybe it was the weather. The weather was cloudy. Oh, in the mid to upper 40s. And rain was forecast, and rain did begin after the address began. So, okay, so super cold and 11 o'clock, and this is 12 o'clock where Trump's about to begin. Rain. I don't know, guys. This looks like a bigger audience than me at about the same time, but maybe the rain kept people away. You could make that argument. Okay. Other thing, but wait, look at this picture. This is crowded, right? Let's look at the structure of the audience. Okay, here's the most important VIP group, members of Congress and so forth. Here's the second closest. These guys are also probably special ticketed. I don't know. Then there's the water here. And then there's people in the back. And look, if you can see, I don't know. There seems to be a lot of people there, but it's so hard. I would definitely think someone who's standing here would think that's a big crowd, but you couldn't really compare it to another crowd. But is this picture consistent with this picture here? Super crowded, super crowded, super crowded right behind the water. Do you think all these empty spaces are invisible from this point of view? I don't know. I'm done with this. The important thing is the following. I showed the previous two slides only to demonstrate an example of critical thinking, not to say anything about any of the presidents. Did I reason dispassionately? Did I seem open to both sides of an issue? Did I seem open to ideas that conflicted with my own? I didn't tell you what my ideas are, so you wouldn't know that. Did I demand evidence for claims? And did I use logic properly, deducing and inferring properly? I hope I did. Also, I'll say the following. You're supposed to be able to distinguish matters of fact from issues of judgment or opinion and reach well-supported factual or judgmental conclusions from a wide diversity of real-world examples. So, you know what? I am allowed, according to this phrase, to reach judgmental conclusions. And I will conclude that actually, I think Obama's crowd was larger than Trump's. But I'd be open to new evidence if anyone had some. Okay, lastly, scientists are supposed to use critical thinking when they are at work. It is our job to do that. But is it okay for us to do other things when they are not at work? Well, one would presume so. A steel worker, when they come home from work, should be allowed to not be a steel worker. But I'm showing this picture here of NASA scientist James Hansen being arrested at a climate change protest. He was part of a peaceful demonstration, but I guess he broke the law, so they're hauling him away. And he is not practicing critical thinking now, he's practicing passionate advocacy. And it's a really interesting discussion over whether that is okay for a scientist to do or not. And the reason it might not be okay, on one hand, well, sure, when you're off the clock, you can do whatever you want. Okay. On the other hand, the objectivity of a scientist is important. And if this guy who's a NASA scientist, he's a federal employee, his job is to dispassionately exercise critical thinking, and then off work he's doing really big advocacy stuff, it might seem that there's a conflict of interest between those two things. So that raises ethical issues that I won't go into now. I just want to float them up for your attention. Okay, lecture's been long enough, and next up is going to be probably the most important lecture of the semester, all about science. See you there. Bye.